All right, welcome to Unexpected Points, back-to-back daily episodes here with Josh Hermsmeyer yesterday and my friend Ben Gretch today. Ben, you've been over the last, I don't know, I think it was last season also. I think I saw a Bill Barnwell appearance. Now you are on the Athletic Football Pod earlier this week. So I have to ask, when I sent out an invite, were you just bored and wanted to talk to someone? Because I know you got bigger fish to fry now that you're part of the football media elite.
No, absolutely not. I've been waiting for the invite. I don't think I've jumped on with you yet. We worked together back like when I was first starting, and you were still doing kind of some fantasy football stuff back in 2016. I've always had a ton of respect for your work and your content.
That's like OG. That's like OG by fantasy football standards.
That's right. We've been around too long. A lot has changed since 2016. A lot has changed by in the way that fantasy football is played, and a lot of that stuff is considered. I know that's some of the stuff that we want to talk about today. So excited to jump on with you.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about some of that stuff. I'll talk about some of the old boomer strategies that were maybe being developed back when we were starting off, where they stand now. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the industry, actually, now that you mentioned that, how the industry has changed a bit, because I have transitioned into someone who, plays in my home league. Haven't really done, I used to just do a degenerate amount of best ball stuff during the off season. Haven't really done that the last couple of off seasons, which is, where the truth is found in those leagues. And then I've peeled off a little bit as far as DFS was never really my thing, just because I don't know. I'm not into the sweat. I'm not into the sweat maybe as much as some people are, and I get enough just out of my normal takes as to what the truth is or not of the NFL. But as far as the fantasy football industry, what have you seen that has changed the most? Because I'm coming from an environment where I saw RotoViz, Fantasy Douche, RIP, or wherever you are out there, if you're still hanging around, was doing some stuff in R, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. He has some little graphs on here. I'm going to learn some of this. I'm going to add my content to, which was a pretty bad, like, narrative based content that was really out there across the board. But what have we seen recently? And I guess this is part of what we're going to talk about. Has it gone too far now with everyone knows how to code up a little bit of R and put their stats out there?
Well, too far is subjective, but I think that, it's a market-based game, and we're always looking for, edges and opportunities to find things to exploit that we think the market is missing or is overcorrecting to or is overvaluing and all of those types of things. I think over the years, the market has gotten sharper. We've moved towards, an equilibrium point in some ways that I think makes the game a lot more fun to analyze, because there's a lot of different things that then become viable. I think back then, some of the tenets of like a zero RB strategy and some of the ideas of not getting really, really heavy on running back value early, and some of the, the work that I built off of that, and did a lot of stuff on the running back dead zone, and showed how, like, if you're taking running backs in like rounds 3, 4, 5, when these drafts used to be really running back heavy, that's probably going to hurt your win percentage and those types of things. You need to be getting wide receivers actually heavier in the early rounds. And that stuff got bought into really heavily. I think that you talked about the increasing popularity of best ball and how I think that's caused things to really iterate quickly. The other thing I would just say is, like, fantasy football is a young man's game, man. Like, there's like people love to do this when they have, you talked about how you've kind of moved away from it. People love to do this when they have free time, when they're in their early 20s. I was a lot more like deep into it before I made it a career, when I was in my 20s and had free time. And I think there's always these new up and coming sharp people, and the new generation of analysts is so, adept at using data and that type of information and applying it and applying these types of strategies. They're way more willing to latch on to the conceptual stuff behind something like a zero RB, why the tenets of that made sense strategically. I think you have like I don't know, maybe a more game playing generation that is like we're trying to find ways to beat a game based on a game, not necessarily analyze football. And so there's a lot, there's always new, like every couple of years, we talked about, like, you and I used to work together 8 years ago. That's like 5 generations of fantasy analysts, because there's so many, the life lifespan of a lot of fantasy analysts is like 2 years, right? Like it's not. I mean, they people come in and they come in hot the first couple of years. I always reference the Dunning-Kruger effect chart where, the overconfidence versus actual competence, where early on people are very, very confident in their takes, and then you hit this, like, I think it's referred to as like the valley of despair or what have you. It's like, I learned a couple things. Like you don't want to be too overconfident. Like a lot of this stuff is really tricky to get right in the NFL space. And then hopefully over time, you're building a certain degree of confidence in your takes, but still with a measured understanding that there is plenty of uncertainty when you're trying to analyze a sport like football in a league like the NFL. But that's not to say that every new analyst gets it wrong or whatever, but there are people that come in and spend a lot of time with the data and come to really quick conclusions from the data that maybe aren't moving the needle. One of the things I loved about what you mentioned, Fantasy Douche, what he used to do way back in the day was he would be like, how can we use the data to simplify, but essentially to save time, but get the same results? Like, is it getting us results as the scouters and things like that? Can I prove that my quicker process is actually as good as these other processes? Some of the stuff that I see these days with the data, from more of a domain knowledge perspective, but not really through a provable perspective, I just am very skeptical that it's going to be applied correctly and actually used to win leagues correctly. And so there's, in some cases, a little bit of an overcorrection. There's multiple ways to come at it. It depends, when as we approach this equilibrium, there are still people that are too far to sort of the old way of doing things. And I do think there are people that go too far towards sort of the new way of doing things, if you will.
Yeah, I think maybe this is a function of the fact that I'm a boomer and I'm like a Twitter only type of social media content, where I assume there is like a big TikTok fantasy space or something. I'm not sure if you're aware of this thing, but I could see how it could move in the other direction a bit there, right? As you compress the delivery method, where it's not a written piece, but it's a quick TikTok, you could go even further in the narrative kind of shock value type of content away from the numbers on that side. I'm just not seeing any of that, but I presume that it's out there.
I am not seeing it either. I wrote a piece almost exactly a year ago. Just pulled it up while you said that. It was August 9th last year. That I titled "Fantasy Analysis Keeps Getting Better and Worse," and talked through how the overall way that fantasy analysis is layering in more advanced data and more advanced strategies and ways of thinking is absolutely moving forward. But that exact point that you made was the and worse part, that the way that we consume information is evolving. And it does turn us, I think, into a little bit of a rabbit hole of quick hitting analysis, as I wrote in the introduction to that piece, as I'm looking at it right now. But you, again, we go back to these old Rotoviz days. You referenced Fantasy Douche. I remember, one of his first pieces of advice to me was you want to seek out the counterclaim to any claim you're making. When we're writing an article, like, what's a good approach is if you're going to make any type of claim, whether that be, first of all, you need to support it with evidence, whether that be statistical evidence, logic, something, right? You have to give the reader a reason to follow you in your belief, was something he used to love to say. And then it was seek out the counterclaim, seek out what somebody on the other side would argue, and give the reader a reason why that's not true. And I think with the quick hitting analysis, you're skipping a lot of that type of stuff. That's why the longer form written stuff, I think, does matter in the fantasy space, because you do need to talk through the scenarios where you might be not, evaluating the situation correctly, where things may break differently in season. One of the pieces of content I did in the past year was looking at past projections and showing how we get our assumptions about offenses pretty wrong, actually, in terms of like overall team volume, pass attempts, rush attempts, just looking at the high level stuff. And a lot of that just is the fact that the NFL seasons are chaos. Like my projections for the Jets last year assumed Aaron Rodgers would play quarterback all year, and then he tore his Achilles on the second snap or whatever. My assumption for the Colts assumed that Anthony Richardson would play a lot more than he did, and then you go away from a mobile quarterback. I mean, it's a little more nuanced, but Gardner Minshew changes the pass rate and the pass attempts in an offense compared to a young, mobile, rookie age 21, I think, quarterback last year. I would have projected the Colts differently if I would have known that Anthony Richardson was going to play 2 2/3 games. There's breakouts. There are underperformances. There are injuries on offensive lines. And it's actually, it comes out to like half the league where you should expect your like volume, just team level volume projections are going to be meaningfully inaccurate. And so that's the kind of stuff where you look at it and you go, okay, I mean, I have to be aware that what I'm doing from a prediction standpoint can be wrong. And I need to think through what the counterclaim might be or other ways that things may go. If I'm making a case that, hey, this guy's a steal at this cost for these reasons, I also need to give, well, there are other, possible things. Here's a reason to follow me in this belief. Here's a reason that this belief may be wrong. And that, yeah, I mean, that's sort of, yeah, I'm a crusty old man too, man. The idea that this TikTokification of the way that we consume information, I do think it impacts that.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I think like the whole argument is like kind of doing a steel man rather than a straw man on the counter argument, and that does become more difficult when you make a claim. I'm trying to think. Maybe like last year, I was not so high on Lamar Jackson being like the real MVP. At least until the last couple weeks of the season, but I still wasn't that high on it. But you get so much crap thrown back at you that in a way you can use these awful counter arguments to have more confidence in your own take, because you're like, oh my God, these arguments are so bad. That's why as part of that process, I tried to go through and say, okay, if they're going to say he has some unique, abilities with this and that, let's actually try to quantify some of those things and then figure out where we stand at the end. So, okay, well, so here's the plan here. I want to talk through some of the old school strategies, figure out what still exists here. We'll talk a little bit about where we've evolved. Have we evolved kind of past the numbers based some analysis, which is analogous to what some people say in baseball, somewhat in basketball, like sports that are longer along the curve of the actual quote unquote analysis, what's happened there. And then we'll talk through some ADPs that I'm looking at that, as someone who's naive and hasn't been paying as much attention, that you can help walk me through here. So I have some of these catchphrase sort of strategies written down here. There's probably some that I'm not remembering here, but we'll go all the way back to we'll give credit to my man JJ Zachariason here for late round quarterback. That seems to have been out basically over the last few years, as you have these quarterbacks who uniquely in the history, well, not uniquely, but in much more of a multitude sort of way are combining passing and rushing success together, which is kind of let that go. Do you think there's any, is that dead? Or is it a potential something to still look at a little bit, or what do we think about late round quarterback?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, it's a market-based game, right? So 2 years ago was when we really saw Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, those guys score in a way that was, just so dynamic and really changed things. We go back 4 or 5 years ago, you have Patrick Mahomes' breakout season as a later round quarterback, and then Lamar Jackson the next year are both later round quarterbacks and are super dynamic fantasy scores those years. But they also shoot up in ADP the next year and immediately are top 5 quarterbacks. And I do think we're in an era now where that, we've had some stability in the top of the quarterback position. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Lamar Jackson are the top 4 quarterbacks drafted this year. Last year, after the 2 years ago that I referenced, those guys started to go really high. And so it became a conversation about, again, go back 8 years ago or so when late round quarterback was, and even earlier when JJ was really driving this point home, people were drafting quarterbacks in the first round in their home leagues. And it was an opportunity cost question about to go get Peyton Manning in the first round or get a quarterback that can give you a reasonable floor of production in the late rounds and draft other positions in the early rounds. Over time, became...
One quick thing. I just remember, just as a contextual thing on late round quarterback. So it's my understanding that JJ really came up with this post 2011 when you had Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Cam Newton, and Matthew Stafford at the top. And then there was like a 50, 60 point fantasy gap to everyone else. And things had kind of gone crazy after that. So that's the context, I believe, where late round quarterback came from. So it's quite a ways ago. It's post 2011.
And then it gets widely accepted in the ecosystem, and even the the top quarterbacks start to go much later. For a few years there, I think the QB1's going off in the 4th or the 5th round, and you're getting basically value at every quarterback spot relative to where the quarterbacks used to go. And so this conversation of opportunity cost changes. When you start talking about, I mentioned the idea of the running back dead zone a little bit ago, and I'm sure we'll talk about that as we go through some of these concepts. When you talk about the opportunity cost of running back hit rates in the 1st or 2nd round versus the 4th or 5th round, it's a massive difference historically. And so if you're bypassing a potential, legendary running back in the first couple rounds versus a group of running backs in the 4th or 5th round where the hit rates are traditionally very low to draft a really high-end quarterback, it's a different conversation. Going into 2023, those quarterbacks got back up to like round 2, and people started to justify that because they score differently now, because that combination of rushing and passing that you talked about leads to a really different upside equation, that we should be drafting them that highly. And that didn't really pan out super effectively last year, and now we're getting a little bit of discount again. It's going to be different in home leagues and those things, but like over on Underdog last year, which is the best ball platform where you're getting a ton of volume. And so I tend to refer to that when I think of like the wisdom of the crowds element of ADP, where, we're getting a pretty robust set of drafts over there. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, those guys were 2nd round picks last year. They're 4th round picks this year, or late 3rd round picks this year. So they're going quite a bit later, even though they both ran for 15 touchdowns last year and actually scored in a pretty meaningful way. But it's sort of an admission by the market that the opportunity cost is too high in the 2nd round. Essentially, it starts to make some sense in the 4th round. So as far as late round QB and how it fits and how it works right now, I do think even just over these last couple years, number one, there's been a change in the ways that the very top quarterbacks can score and what that means for how the late round quarterbacks can, reproduce that type of scoring. Because back in the day, you reference even like a Matthew Stafford and Peyton Manning and those guys, they're just passers, and they're very efficient passers, but it's a very different scoring equation than a guy who can run for 15 touchdowns and throw for a bunch of yards.
And that 2011 season was an outlier with guys putting up like a bunch of guys putting up 5,000 yards, or close to 5,000 yards passing, which just doesn't happen.
Right. And so I do think we're better at, in the current landscape, after the league has evolved, the ways that defenses play have pushed more teams towards embracing, I think, mobile quarterbacks, because what it does for you schematically on the field, that we have evolved towards understanding and ranking quarterbacks better top to bottom. And then ADP of where the very top elite ones go has bounced around even in just the last couple of years, but I think is reaching this equilibrium point as well, where, I do think, the idea of late round quarterback as a cheat code probably has, the concepts still make a ton of sense, but probably has kind of gone away at this point because it's been a decade and a half, like you said, and the market is baking it in enough that I think you can make a pretty strong case that depending on league type or your build or whatever you're doing, you could take quarterbacks at any point of a draft, and it's not wrong, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So, I guess in conjunction with that, so again, we're going old school here. So the Konami Code, Rich Rebar, I remember one of the guys, it's probably not good to mention this because I don't know if he's much of a success, but I think it was Jake Locker, may have been a guy that he used as an example back in the day as someone like, hey, maybe this guy can run and can give some sort of floor that a lot of other quarterbacks don't have, and we should look at them. So this kind of goes into what we're saying about the late round quarterback being dead, because you have some guys who are passing efficient and they have that Konami Code. But at the same time, I have seen, and this is something actually I was going to talk about, and I want to talk about Anthony Richardson maybe a little bit, and I have him later, but we can also talk about the context of there now is, can it be overly adopted in a way where we don't know anything really about how good a quarterback is going to be in the NFL passing the ball? And then we assume they're going to run the ball, which, happens most of the time. I think we're pretty good about projecting those guys, but not necessarily there. So then we push them pretty far up based upon that, where we really don't know. I guess you could say like Justin Fields or someone like that when he was coming in. It paid off a little bit later in his second season where he's breaking off 60-yard runs, but not as much beforehand. Even CJ Stroud, you would have assumed he's not going to run that much, but then he had a really good year because that efficiency portion that came through. So how do we think about Konami Code now? And especially when we don't even know, like if these guys are good passers or not. I think people are very comfortable making guys, easily into the top 10 picks, if not the top 8, 7 picks, when we don't even know if they can pass the ball or not.
Yeah, I think the Richardson conversation is such a fun one. I think with all of these strategies, the underlying concepts made sense, and that's why they caught on, and that's why they were a thing. And for a while, you could leverage that because half the market didn't want to admit that they made sense or didn't understand them. When you talk about the Konami Code, talk about Jake Locker, I know one of the early, or a couple of the early players he wrote about as well were like Tim Tebow and Terrell Pryor, and those guys were really good in fantasy at a time where they couldn't throw, basically, but because they could provide,
Tebow like literally could not throw passes. Yeah,
but you could draft him in the last round or pick him up off of waivers.
He was good. I think I had a good playoff run with him one of these years where he was playing at the end of the season. So yeah,
and so the idea was like back then it was like to a certain degree it was like fantasy football is not real football. It doesn't matter that Tim Tebow can't throw the ball down the field. He could be your good fantasy quarterback, even though you think he's a terrible NFL quarterback. And so the idea that, rushing value, because of the way that we score in fantasy. I mean, ultimately, if you really want to, get into the nuance of it, every 10 yards is worth a point rushing, every 20 or 25, depending on your scoring system, passing is worth a point. And so if more of your yardage gained as a quarterback leans towards the rushing side, that's going to be important. And then a lot of these leagues, passing touchdowns are only worth 4 points. Some of them are still 6 points. But if you can be a guy who runs for a lot of TDs in a 4-point per passing TD league, that's really meaningful. 2 rushing TDs is 3 passing TDs. And so obviously you can understand how that scales and the things that adds a boost to overall scoring over the course of a season when, some of these really elite guys like Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen are running for 15 TDs now. But that is very much in the market now. And I think it's so in the market, and this is one of the ones where I think that sort of the TikTokification, as we were talking about, is very fascinating, because I think there are some people that are just like, Anthony Richardson has mobile upside. He belongs in a tier with Lamar Jackson and all those other guys. And the guy that he's been drafted near all offseason is CJ Stroud. And it's like CJ Stroud doesn't have mobile upside. And so they don't belong in the same tier. And we're talking about projection-based stuff a little bit. And I know you wanted to talk about that a little on the show. And I think it's fascinating because whenever I do projections, the rushing quarterbacks come out really well because I do have to give them a certain floor of that type of production, and it usually boosts them. Like, for example, Jane Daniels is coming out this year as a rookie, and he's going a little bit later, but he comes out pretty solidly in my projections, like a value. And that's the type of like Konami Code application for me, is when a guy isn't that expensive and I'm like, this guy has untapped upside if he hits, because the way that he hits statistically is going to be, very, very meaningful for fantasy scoring. Anthony Richardson's going like QB5 for a lot of people, and people are saying he belongs in the top tier, and we don't really know what he is as a passer. He only really played 1 year of college football. He played 2 2/3 games last year. He left 2 different games after only about a third of the snaps. Both of his injuries came on designed runs. I will note that for him as a stylistic quarterback, and I've gotten into some of this nuance, and then people will say that, like, I hate Anthony Richardson, but stylistically, he's not a guy who holds onto the ball. Like, I know you do a lot of work with, like, sack rate and that kind of stuff. This guy doesn't take a lot of sacks, and as part of that, doesn't scramble a lot either. He gets rid of the ball. It's actually very different than Jane Daniels. If you look at their college scramble rates, which there are 2 types of quarterback rushing, scramble and design runs. But if you look at their college scramble rates and also their sack rates, Daniels clearly way higher in scramble rate and also higher in sack rate. This is a playmaker. When the play breaks down, he holds onto the ball and he tries to create. You mentioned Justin Fields. That was an example of that type of player. So I do think now
someone who can't like execute the passing play. If you want to look at the flip side. If you want to look at the flip side. If you're like, that's another thing I was looking at for quarter. Yeah, I mean, if you're saying 30% of the time you drop back to pass, the ball doesn't leave your hand. It's not great.
No, that's not good for pass attempts. It's not good for fantasy and the offense. Like, that's really important context as well. But in terms of this, like the Konami Code theory, to me, there's a lot that just comes back to the little bits of nuance about the, I just think like analysis needs to actually, in today's day and age where this kind of stuff is baked into the market, needs to get more nuanced and better. And we need to actually talk through the different elements of it. So another thing that I like to do with my projections is look at the market expectations, look ahead lines for team scoring. And then I have a little formula that takes overall team expected points and turns it into offensive touchdowns. And then I project reasonably close to a team's offensive touchdowns. Now, one of the things you should do with your projections always is recognize that there is a way for teams to massively outperform expected points. Like the Houston Texans last year are the prime example. They were all going very late. And if you were in on them as an offense, then you smashed. CJ Stroud was a huge hit, and that brought along Nico Collins. It brought along Tank Dell as a great play. It made Dalton Schultz a somewhat viable late round tight end play. Devin Singletary ends up being a good late round running back, not a great one, but a viable one. And so, that is something that I keep in mind is teams can outperform. But when I go through a projection for a team like the Colts, I do need to be I try to make sure I'm respecting the market expectations. And the Colts they're about average in terms of expected points. But when you get down into the projection, unless you're projecting like Jonathan Taylor to not score any points, and I do expect, when we talked about the Anthony Richardson design runs, where those led to some injuries and stuff, I do expect they're going to use Taylor in the red zone, and he's going to have a decent rushing TD rate. And so one of the big things with these mobile QBs is like they gobble up all the touchdowns for their offense. They either run them or they throw them. Like Jalen Hurts, the running backs don't tend to score in that offense. He's either running it or he's throwing it. Josh Allen, somewhat similar, right? Or very similar in that regard. Richardson, I think there's some question about how much he can gobble up all the touchdowns in an offense that's also expected to score less than the Bills in the Eagles. And you get through a whole projection and you're like, man, I projected his rushing really aggressively. For me, I have him in the top 3 in rushing yards and the top 3 in rushing TDs, and the only quarterback that's in the top 3 in both, because with him in the top 3 in yards, I have Lamar and Jane Daniels, and in the top 3 in TDs, I have Josh Allen and Hurts, because those are a little bit different profiles. I'm projecting Richardson with a very small sample to be a dynamic yardage runner as a quarterback and a dynamic touchdown scorer as a quarterback. And yet when you do all of that, it means that you have to kind of consider, unless the Colts are this year's breakout team, that their passing numbers are not going to be very effective. And he's actually in this like Tebow and Pryor realm, not that player, right? But in terms of how
I'm clipping this. Anthony Richardson passes like Tim Tebow.
No, I mean, I think we don't know enough about Richardson, but in terms of what that can mean statistically, you have to think through, like, can this guy throw for 4,000 yards? Can he throw for 25 touchdowns? When I get through my projections for Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, there's meat on the bone in their offenses that even if I project them for, double-digit rushing TDs, I have them hitting those plateaus. I have them both thrown for 4,200 yards and 25-plus TDs. Richardson, I have at 3,700 yards and 21 TDs, and that's a plateau in terms of how that manifests for fantasy. And so there are a lot of people that are like Anthony Richardson, huge, athletic, runs. And my thing is like, I do think the design run rate is going to be there, to be clear, but he got hurt on multiple design runs last year. So I'm a little bit skeptical of it, but I do think it's going to be there. And I'm projecting a really high design run rate. But when you also look at the 2 types of QB rushing I was talking about, you look at the scramble rate being low. He's not going to stylistically add a lot of, free rushing stats by scrambling, because he does tend to get rid of the ball. You're like, okay, this is a different equation in terms of, how big his rushing ceiling can really be. And I'm projecting it big, but when it's also baked into the market at that point as well, right? People want to take him QB5 and they're saying he's going to smash from there. Like how much better than QB5 can he really be when we get into the opportunity cost equation? So I found myself a little, like, I'm taking some Anthony Richardson because I can see how the profile can manifest in those seasons where the Colts are the breakout team, and he's an MVP candidate, and he's this young superstar. And I do think that's plausible, but I'm taking less of him than most other analysts that would lean on stuff like the Konami Code and understand the tenets of that. I'm taking more of a Jaden Daniels. I'm taking more of later round quarterbacks that I think it applies to. Daniel Jones, who I think is bad at football, but is going really, really late, coming off an ACL, and the Giants looking horrible, but has Malik Neighbors now. I mean, I think you can take him very, very late and be like, well, he's going to add a little bit of running value, and that's helpful. Like, those are the ways that I apply the Konami Code at this point, not the spots where the market's like very, very in on it and it's already priced in.
Yeah. Richardson's an interesting guy because I feel like he gave us just enough as a rookie that the people who were high on him coming out, which were quite a lot of people. I mean, he got, he came as like, oh, maybe he can be a top quarterback, to a lot of people advocating based upon his physical traits that he should be the QB1 of that draft class. Like, he gave just enough where the reality is we didn't learn anything, I don't think, really about him. I mean, he didn't like just shit his pants when he went back to pass or something. Like, he was functional, right? But he kind of displayed the things that we would have been worried about with some accuracy and some other stuff. And he did, but there were clips, right? You can put together your film clips and figure out about him. So yeah, I think he's an interesting guy. Okay,
yes,
let's
it's
go
just a
back
small
to
sample.
yeah.
He basically played 2 full games. One game
Yeah.
he looked awesome. The other game, I think he was like 11 for 25.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, this is like both sides of the equation are fitting in here. Like we see the upside. We also see that, if he's going to complete 40% of his passes, that's a problem.
Yeah, but I mean, I will say I like him a lot more as a second-year player than as a rookie because I don't think you really have to play to get the development from first to second year. I mean, we saw right when we saw Patrick Mahomes come in and just win an MVP in his first year and in his second season. I think there's just something natural about development that comes with being in the NFL, studying, getting used to the pace, even in practice and things like that. That doesn't necessarily have to be on the field. So yeah, I wouldn't comp him necessarily to a rookie coming in when it comes to passing, and so that should be helpful for him. Okay,
Good enough.
I don't know if we have to really talk about zero RB. Again, a history lesson here. This goes back to Sean Siegel's win, I believe in 2012 season
13
or 2013 season, where he actually won. Of course, the little caveat here is he actually won with his team that had Jamal Charles on the team. I guess I think it was the season with the Raiders where he caught like 3 dump offs and just ran them. Alex Smith doing work, throwing them out to the dump offs.
I think he had 5 receiving touchdowns in that game, or 5 total touchdowns. It was absurd.
Yeah, so that was like Alex Smith is a perfect quarterback for him. But he had these other teams which also placed very well, where he started like, Megatron and Jimmy Graham, I think was like a popular start that he had, something like that. They ended up doing really well. And it was just really well-written piece. It was thought-provoking. I mean, I would say it's maybe like you'd have to put it on like the Mount Rushmore of greatest fantasy football pieces ever written as far as impact and everything else, and not just like regurgitating and repackaging something. At the same point in time, now that we're in the era that we're in, where running back workloads are even more split in a way, but at the same point in time, you might be less likely to find someone who will pop out of nowhere and take over a big running back load as a injury substitution that you could find in the past. I mean, it's still available, but I don't know like how prevalent it is versus being able to find those guys in the past. Where do we stand on zero running back?
I mean, I think, again, this is another one where the tenets were sound. And so it becomes like, how do you apply it when the market shifts?
Because
so
it's
when
anti-fragility, right? That was the thing.
Right.
Nicholas Taleb, I believe, was the one who had anti-fragile. So yeah, so as chaos ensues, you get stronger versus being robust, which protects you against chaos, but you don't get stronger as potentially stronger. So you get stronger as running back injuries happen. You can scoop up these guys on the waiver wire and other things of that nature, or have them on the end of your bench. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So when he wrote that, 11 of the first 12 picks in the first round of fantasy drafts by average draft position were running backs. We live in a landscape now where routinely
he was getting Calvin Johnson and Jimmy Graham on the 1-2 turn type of situation.
That's the wide receiver
prime
one.
Megatron. This is prime Megatron sort of season. Yeah.
Wide receiver 1 plus tight end 1 at a time when tight end 1 would go as high as wide receiver 1. I mean, you're talking about
Jimmy Graham was essentially a wide receiver. He was incredible with the Saints.
And so this year we have McCaffrey, Bijan, Breece Hall, sometimes Gibbs right at 12, basically like 4. I mean, in home leagues, I think you'll see 5 or 6 running backs go, but it's unquestionable that wide receivers go massively higher now. I think there's also reasons for that because, like you just talked about, the lack of like massive workload running backs. Some of that goes back to just the last like handful of draft classes. We've had a lot of busts or underperformances or injuries. The guys that should be in their prime right now, like we just haven't had, like Jonathan Taylor and Breece Hall are kind of the 2 hits from like the 2019 to 2022 range, where you have Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Najee Harris as like some busts in the first round. Then you have a lot of
you don't have many guys who have more than a season, and we're not even talking about last season necessarily, more than a season's worth of performance. This is not like when you were drafting LaShawn McCoy and Jamal Charles when they had been in the top 5 for like 3 straight years or something like that. And then you just were continuing to draft them. Or Le'Veon Bell kept on racking up. You had these guys that were like stalwarts. Obviously they fell off eventually, but you don't really have much of that anymore beyond Christian McCaffrey.
Yep. That has definitely been an issue. I mean, even the hits like a Travis Etienne missed his whole, rookie season. So he's going into like age 25 and we have 2 years of data, which is weird. Like, usually you have at least a third year for these guys that are hits, but J.K. Dobbins and A lot of those dudes have had some real injury issues that were some exciting profiles. So that is, a big part of what has happened with the market. The other part is just that there's been an understanding that running backs are a little bit more fragile in the early rounds. You have this idea of anti-fragility. Wide receivers, year over year, we're better at predicting which wide receivers are going to finish at the top of scoring. The one thing that I would note that, you're talking about maybe we can't get these late round running backs to really prop up. I mean, last year we had a couple that were really meaningful. Raheem Mostert led the NFL in touchdowns from the double-digit rounds, which is something that almost never happens. We're pretty good at also predicting the guys who can really lead the league in running back scoring.
I guess I was thinking kind of like workhorse, like they come in and then they can workhorse in a way, which it still can happen, but maybe not as much as we've seen in the past.
Well, the other one I was going to mention was Kyron Williams, and by week 2 or week 3, he was getting like 100% of the running back touches, which was wild. Yeah. But those are more outlier-ish. One thing I did write about recently is as we move away from early running back ADPs, there's that many backfields that nobody is getting drafted high. Now, I don't think they're going to be workhorse situations, but there's backfields that we think are going to have value as a whole. And the reason no one's getting drafted high is exactly what you said. That's probably going to be split. But like the Browns, the Cowboys, the Chargers, the Broncos are all backfields that I think are going to have a lot of fantasy points in them. And nobody's getting drafted even like the first 10 rounds in Underdog. I mean, they're all like, that's a lot of available late round running back points. The tricky part is, as you said, kind of getting that. How does that manifest, and how does that all come together, and getting that figured out in terms of how it scores throughout the year. But then the other side of it is if we don't have a Le'Veon Bell or a David Johnson or a prime Todd Gurley at the top, how much do we have to replace? What is the replaceability of it? Running backs can crop up and have these spike weeks when they're in the roles. And one of the big ideas of zero RB is like, when to start the late round running back. Alexander Madison's been a great example of this the last half decade, where when Dalvin Cook was out, you started Alexander Madison and he would reliably return 20-point games in those games, but he never would get like volume more than 1 week. Like Cook would miss like one game. You would never get it more than 1 week at a time, but you knew which week to start him. It's not like it's confusing. One of the things when people look at past data, they're like, oh, but this wide receiver was good. Wide receiver production tends to be more spike week driven. They're out there running routes every week, and then a guy hits 1 week. You wouldn't know in a season-long league when to put him in your lineup, when he's going to spike. Gabe Davis is a great example. He had actually a decent run of 20-point games last year, but if you go look at his game log, it's like every third week like clockwork. And the next week, when people were putting him in their lineup, he was trash every single time. So a couple times after a 20-point game, he had 0. And people had the 20 points on their bench, and then they put him in their lineup, and they had the 0 in their lineup. And that's why everybody hates Gabe Davis. It's just like the sequencing of his scoring. But that is something that is very true at receiver with the late round guys that even score points, is you really know when to play them. And with running back, you typically do. You know when you have a hit. And on a weekly level, when we're predicting it, I always think about it in terms of like DFS. When we're predicting DFS salaries and things, we know who the plays are at DFS, or in DFS. We know who the running back plays are. Like, this is the Alexander Madison week. Everyone's playing Alexander Madison. He's the chalk because Dalvin Cook's out. There weren't Gabe Davis weeks in the same way. The ways that these guys, scoring can spike are different in terms of how we can predict them. And that's a big part of the zero RB idea, and the idea that you should, build your fantasy teams through the wide receiver position early. Those are the wide receivers that you do know are going to get volume every week, because earning targets is kind of a skill. There's a stickiness to it, and the stars get volume. They get targets every week, whether that be through them just getting open all the time, whether that be through offenses run through them, first read targets, those types of things. And so this idea of zero RB, the running back dead zone, I do still think there's a lot of meat on the bone there and a lot of value there when you get into these, situations where everyone's doing it, or like on Underdog, receivers are going really high. And I start hearing people saying, well, you got to zig when others zag. And I'm like, that's not a strategy in and of itself. You need to explain to me why zigging makes sense, because I think even if wide receivers are going high, I actually think that puts more imperative on getting the receivers early, because it pushes down running back values. When you get in these really extreme Underdog drafting, best ball drafting rooms, you can get some really good running backs in round 10. Well, if I just lean into the wide receiver runs early and take all my wide receivers and go zero RB, it's easier than ever. I don't have to sacrifice running back points. I can go get James Conner as my RB1 in like the 9th round. And that's a dude who had a career season last year, 5 yards per carry, 1,000 yards. And the team's saying he's clearly starting over the young rookie Trey Benson that they drafted. The information out of Cardinals camp is that as long as James Conner's healthy, he's our guy right now. Trey Benson's sort of the secondary back. And so I'm not, all in on Conner, but he's a guy who years ago would have gone 3 or 4 rounds higher. And that's a great example to me of how the market has really shifted and how that changes strategy, and how the answer isn't just to zig when others zag, without understanding why the market is moving in a direction that is probably more towards an equilibrium than, exuberance and too much excitement about wide receivers. It's more about, there are underlying tenets and reasons why you would be drafting these wide receivers as early as you are. And as you get in these really wide receiver heavy rooms, it makes it tough to get enough wide receiver firepower, because you run out of good wide receivers that have real upside much earlier. And so you really have to understand the tenets to understand how you want to adjust as the rooms change and as the ADP changes and the things change. Me and a lot of people who draft like me often get kind of described as just being wide receiver zealots and not thinking critically. And I'm like, man, I'm thinking incredibly critically about the way this changes. I'm constantly trying to reevaluate if this is the way to do it. But as far as I believe, like, I don't see any reason why you would just say, oh, hey, the wide receivers are going to be gone by the end of round 6 or round 7 in a draft. Let's go draft a bunch of early running backs and try and cobble it together with these late round receivers that we know don't have the ability to earn big volume and hit in a massive way. People will point at Puka Nacua. He's like a decade-long outlier. And there's not other examples like a Puka Nacua from late round wide receiver rooms. And also, it's very difficult to identify Puka Nacua, as evidenced by the fact that he wasn't even drafted in most best ball leagues last year. He was drafted in, I think, fewer than 50% of the leagues. And so it is a fascinating thing to think about how we're moving towards, as a market, moving towards the tenets of some of these concepts, but how the concepts still are very important to understand as you think about how to build the best types of teams, both from a floor and ceiling perspective, in a changing landscape.
Now, it's interesting because I think, again, I'm a little bit looking back, maybe a little bit too far, thinking about zero RB and all the different battles there. But I would say that part of the original strategy was probably also targeting or thinking about running backs in what would be called the dead zone now. So, like, thinking about these two things versus each other. If I remember correctly, some of Sean's successful teams that season took Le'Veon Bell as his first running back in the mid rounds, who was injured to start his year, but then came on pretty well. I remember Sean and I used to be in pretty good contact. And a couple of years after that, we were all in on Tevin Coleman as a rookie, and he started off pretty hot, but then he got injured, and then Devontae Freeman basically ended up being blood taking on there. But it was, another dead zone sort of guy, right? Like, they were being drafted, I think, in similar ranges because no one knew what was going to happen there. But now it has been like, don't draft in the dead zone. I've thought about drafting in the dead zone. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to draft. And then these guys all stink. Like, it really has proven out that they've all been bad. So, like, if you're zero RB and you're not dead zone, then you're just like not drafting anyone until the 10th round or something.
Yeah, so I think the idea of, like, the question is, like, when do you actually get your running backs? I think you can still take them in the first couple rounds. The research I did on the running back dead zone starting back when I was at CBS showed that, you can certainly hit on running backs in the first couple of rounds. It gets really tricky in the middle rounds. The way that I looked at it was purely based on upside, not based on, like, I've seen other people do dead zone research where they're looking at more like a floor element, and they're looking at, like, aggregate points scored from different areas. I think to justify the risk of a running back, because the bust rates are high at the position, you want a return that is high ceiling running back scoring, right? And I looked at the upside a couple different ways. I looked at it from full season points. I looked at it from a points per game perspective with a minimum of games played of like 10. So if a guy played most of the season but was dynamic, that's a really impactful player. And I looked at it in terms of late season scoring as well, to capture the guys that were really dynamic at the end of the season, because we do want to think about the players that come out of nowhere and have these huge runs late in the year. Which is sort of the idea of, like, drafting handcuffs and stuff, what you're hoping for. How often do those hit? And that dead zone range, the late single digit rounds or middle to late single digit rounds, from a percentage of running backs drafted, the real ceiling of these great seasons basically hit at the exact same rate as the double digit rounds. what they do provide you is a little bit more floor, but that's just like this projected touches that aren't actually
feel good
great.
week one. You feel good week one having, like Joe Mixon on your roster.
This
You're
year's
like, okay. You're like, he's going to
Yeah.
start.
Yeah. This year's poster boy for me is Rachaad White, who has not been he's been a very inefficient runner the last couple of years. He's been propped up by volume. They drafted a rookie in Bucky Irving that people are just not buying into at all. One of the big things that I drive home in all my fantasy content is you're looking for, like, a subtitle of an article I wrote last year was, we're looking for outliers. We're looking for players who do things, there's been talks over the years about how much do you regress efficiency. And we're looking for guys who do stuff like what Devon Achane did last year, where he averaged almost 8 yards per carry. We're looking for stuff that you can't project. No one's going to project 8 yards per carry for an NFL running back, but you're thinking about traits and you're thinking about systems and you're thinking about ways that type of thing can happen. And so the issue with a player like a Rachaad White, when I bring him up and kind of speak about him negatively, is for 2 years, he's looked very inefficient as a rusher in a way that it's hard to imagine him being league average, let alone adding the efficiency that's necessary. Like, one of the big things people like to think about is like expected fantasy points and then fantasy points over expected. To have a truly elite running back season, you not only need the workload, which is the expected fantasy points, but you need to add fantasy points over expected. You need to be 3 or 4 points per game better than your workload in fantasy scoring. So you need to be what Austin Eckler has been from an efficiency standpoint. Nick Chubb was constantly that type of player, even though his touch profile doesn't always make him the most exciting scorer because he didn't catch enough passes necessarily. The elite Christian McCaffrey seasons, he's adding efficiency to the absolutely ideal volume profile that Christian McCaffrey also has. That's how you get league winners at the running back position. This dead zone area is typically propped up by projected volume for players that can't actually be outlier efficiency type players. That's why I say Rachaad White's sort of the poster boy for me this year. But yeah, I mean, the places where you can draft running back to me are either the early rounds, because we are very good at identifying the players that are really, really good at running back. And so there's, to me, a wisdom of the crowds element with the dead zone, where if a guy's going in the first or second round, it's because the market understands that this guy's incredibly good and has the potential to add that efficiency that he needs on top of the workload that we're all projecting, which is sometimes harder to get right. But knowing that the player is good does actually come into this equation. Running back is, a replaceable position. We know those elements, but the efficiency side of it does need to happen. And so, in some cases, you can say it's the player good or it's the scheme, it's the system, right? Maybe that is a replaceable element. Maybe Kyren Williams can get replaced by Blake Corum this year, and the Rams wouldn't miss a beat. But the reason Kyren Williams was so good last year is he did add efficiency on top of his workload from a fantasy point scoring perspective, which I think you can give a lot of credit to Sean McVay, the light boxes they face, the way that they do things schematically that helps that. But and the usage in the green zone and the close red zone is really important as well. Scores a lot of touchdowns. But the dead zone traditionally, yes, not an effective way. When you were talking about back in Sean's day, it was a different equation, right? Because so many running backs were going early that you can't. Taking a 10th round running back then meant taking like pure scratch off flyers, right? There would be 50 or 60 running backs that have been drafted by that point, and so you would take like 4 receivers that were like all top 15 guys because nobody's drafting receivers that high. And it was a different equation on how dominant you could get at receiver. And then, yeah, you did need to, like, in round 5, and his initial, people love to reference this, and his initial piece, he was writing about like round 5, when you take a running back. If you think about the way that the landscape has evolved in the last decade since he wrote that, it's really easy to understand why that has evolved to a strategy that pushes running back further from like a round 5 or round 6 to now. If you're doing that in a zero RB, it's strategy. It's not even really zero RB. We kind of talk about it in terms of like you're pulling out of this strategy way too early and you're not actually executing it because you need to, at this point, because you can't get the same type of dominance at wide receiver, you need to get a little bit of contingency value baked into the receiver. You need to take more receivers than you can even start in your league. I like to think about it as 2 extra bench receivers. If you're really going hard at receiver, because you might have a busted receiver too, make sure that you're going to be able to win the wide receiver positions and the flex during bye weeks. And if you have an injury, right? Like, so give yourself that extra value and then take the late round running backs. Because if you start pulling out in round 5 or round 6 and start drafting running backs in today's day and age, again, the hit rates are just as good as they are in round 12 in terms of that real ceiling. And when you can churn the value, the players off the waiver wire and try to hit I think when you start down that path, you really want to push your running back picks late and take a lot of them late and hope you hit on this year's Mostert. That's one of the other good advantages of zero RB is if I'm taking 6 running backs in the double-digit rounds and you're taking 2, I have a volume advantage in terms of trying to hit on this year's Mostert as well. If I am just saying I think there's going to be late round running back points, I don't necessarily know how to identify them, but I'm going to take 6 cracks at it instead of, structurally, because I took so many early running backs, I can only take 2. That's a whole different equation as well. But yeah, for me with the running back picks, it's either very early, first round, second round. You can still do that. And I tell people in home leagues all the time where running backs do get pushed up and you get less stress on getting enough wide receiver depth. I was talking about an underdog. You run out of wide receivers around 6 and 7. Some of these home leagues, you can get these really electric, fun, exciting rookies in like round 10. You can get Xavier Worthy in round 10. And it's like, he adds something to a wide receiver build it is still very dynamic. If he hits, he's going to hit in a very meaningful way. We know that rookies have a certain type of scoring profile that's very profitable for fantasy, even in the higher rounds. But in some formats, they're getting overpriced potentially at this day and age. So, that's another thing we could talk about. But I tell people in home leagues, go ahead and take that early running back if you're into it. Take a Bijan Robinson or a Breece Hall in the middle of the first round, or even as high as like pick 2 or 3 if you really want to, because you're going to be able to get the receiver depth necessary in those formats through like round 10. I have a lot harder of a time taking it, like somewhat, paradoxically, when running backs get cheaper and the values get better, but wide receivers get more expensive, I have a harder time taking the early running backs. Then I want to pound wide receiver as much as I can and then scoop up my running back value late, because the goal for me really is getting enough wide receiver production before we run out of those profiles that have true upside.
Okay, now you were talking about running backs as part of that. It reminded me of kind of one of the main topics that I think jumped out at me for why I wanted to talk with you, and that's the idea of, and you mentioned it here when you're talking about Rachaad White, or you're talking about what Kyren Williams was able to do. This idea that if you go too far in the direction of looking at, here are the correlations and the R squared for all these different metrics, and you aggregate everything. You look at everything in the aggregate, and you use that to figure out who you're going to draft based upon volume productions and what's likeliest to happen. Again, what's likeliest to happen, not what could potentially happen, but what's likeliest to happen. All you're doing is kind of building like a sandwich with a bunch of mediocre, slightly better than mediocre ingredients and shoving it all together, rather than trying to potentially land on something that's outstanding. And again, I think it's a little bit like what's happened in real quote unquote sports. I mean, we're talking about 5-6 years ago. Theo Epstein in baseball was already talking about, when he moved over from the Red Sox to the Cubs, about looking beyond what the analytics are telling them, because they're so far in that direction. I think we're starting to see this somewhat in basketball. I mean, is that really the theme, that you can't play in the aggregate? So if you look at everything in the aggregate, then you're getting, a slight bit of insight, but maybe not enough to actually get you where you want to go at the end, which is to be the top 1 team out of 10, 12, 14 teams in a league.
I think so. And one of the things that they call the R squareds and the football research in general versus other sports is, we know that the football models can't get as predictive as we'd like them to get. And so what a lot of fantasy analysts love to do is talk about, which stats have the highest R squared, so they're the best.
And these are really tiny R squareds. You're comparing incremental differences in very small R squareds.
Right. The predictability isn't extremely high, and the difference, the edges are, the difference in the ranges are not very high. And you get people doing like Twitter victory laps on like, this stat sucks because look, there's other stats that have higher R squareds. And ultimately, I mean, first of all, what I would say is, for a lot of those like more advanced stats, like some of them are advanced or higher predictability ones, some of them are just like baked right into the fantasy scoring. It's like, oh, hey, receptions correlates really well with fantasy points in PPR leagues. Like, yeah, because you get a point for that, right? Like, it's receptions are going to correlate well with fantasy points.
Right.
But like that's my favorite one with the running backs. Like, I always talk about running back receiving being really important, but like, yeah, I mean, you get points for it. It's like touchdowns are good. No, but the different R squareds
Remember
are
old
so
first fantasy football? It was just touchdowns back in the old days before you
yeah,
had like
way back
stats
in
or
the day.
anything. You just track them by the newspaper and by hand. But anyway, now I'm
That's
really
right.
boomerifying myself. But go ahead.
That's when I started. We did the newspaper stuff, but we always had yards, but we didn't have PPR or any of this other stuff. You know,
Oh, I think I had.
you
I
had to
think I was
add
in a
it up.
straight touchdown one for way back. They're not too lazy too
It's
lazy to
like
do anything else.
40 points or 50 points wins the league.
Yeah, you talk
Nobody
about
can
running backs
score.
getting pushed up your board. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that kind of format. Yeah, sure. But yeah, so the R squareds maybe are 0.6 or whatever, and the way I think about it from a statistical perspective is like, okay, so then 40% of the variance is unexplained, right? Like, so that's saying that the whatever the dependent independent variables, you'd be able to speak to this better than me, but like we're describing 60% of the variance based on this other factor, but 40% is unexplained. And to me, most of the 60% is in the market. That stuff's known now. It's very ubiquitous. People, every fantasy analyst, and there are hundreds, knows that data and talks about that type of data, that these stats matter, and they matter for these reasons, whether that's yards per out run, even that, these ones that sound a little bit more advanced, like everyone's factoring that in. This guy's good because the data says he's good. The 40% is the part where I think it's actually pretty interesting, because I think that's actually our job in 2024 as fantasy analysts, is to try to explain the unexplained variance, try to explain why a player may not look as good or looks too good in some of the stats, relative to their, than their cost. Like I'll give an example. Last year,
One quick thing I think of framing on that is like in modeling terms. So first off, if you want to sound smart, you could say features and target rather than independent and dependent. Even though,
okay,
like, who cares?
perfect.
That'll get you some credit.
I need to sound smart.
So it's also like what you're talking about there is essentially like the error. Like that's what it's like at the error in our model. Like there's this error term which fluctuates, but the reality is like it's not just some random pure error. It's just something that we're not able to explain through this simplified model. So you're saying it's digging into
Right.
that and saying we can solve for this error. We can't just say, oh, this is an error. Just throw a random number onto the end of it.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's what I try to do as an analyst, is like, I see people that are like, okay, here's the aggregate data. It shows this. And then here's the player who's the obvious outlier to that. And the context is obvious, but I'm going to apply this data to him and say, we can't apply any of that context. And I'm like, that's why the R squared can't get any higher, is that player right there. It's incredibly obvious. And so, I mean, this is not a great example. It's the first one that popped in my head, and it's one I got right. So we're going to go there. Christian Watson, after his rookie year, had a really high yards per out run, and people wanted to take him like the 4th or 5th round. And I spent the whole offseason trying to explain, because I watch all the games every week and I do care a ton about the data, but I also really try to focus on how the data is actually compiled and understand the football side of it. And I tried to explain in every way I could that Aaron Rodgers was basically spamming him targets. Like in late game situations, he was talking in a post-game interview on one of the Sunday night or Monday night games where they threw to him multiple times inside the 10-yard line late, and he made some mistakes. He got like a false start on a motion play, and he was talking about post-game to like Michelle Tafoya or something, and was like, the young guy wants to win offensive rookie of the year. He's going to have to be better than that if he's going to get his stats. Like, they were openly telling you that Christian Watson was, they wanted to prove that he was worth first-round draft capital. Basically, they wanted him to win offensive rookie of the year, and they were trying to get him as many stats as he could, which is, exciting for fantasy for that particular season. But then the context that Aaron Rodgers is no longer on the team matters. And I was trying to explain this idea of Christian Watson and being a little bit concerned about him as a rookie who has these great efficiency metrics and looks like he's set to explode all of last offseason, because year 2 is the year we really want to buy in. And I can understand why the market was getting really excited about him when you look at his yards per out run, you look at his targets per out run and all that stuff. The one stat in the offseason that I remember that I saw that drove home what I was trying to drive home was Bill Barnwell at one point shared a stat that was like percentage of receiver production that came after win probability was extreme, basically garbage time, right? It was like win probability was greater than 75% or 85% or whatever it was. And it was a list of backup players and Christian Watson. He was the only player that was like getting drafted in the top 10 rounds. And he had sent this last offseason and I'm like, this is what I was trying to say. It's like, it felt like this when you watched the Packers play, where Watson wasn't earning the volume and the normal flow of things. It was like Aaron Rodgers was trying to get him the ball and pad his stats late in games. And the other element to it was like Watson's like per route run stuff was a small sample. He was hurt for much of the year. And so it's like, okay, we're really extrapolating a small sample, like 24% targets per route run or whatever. But I think there was an element of like trying to force this guy the ball at times. And I think we saw that his targets per route run really fell off last year. He doesn't look like a true like target dominant alpha number one wide receiver now, and people are profiling him differently. But that's an idea of, the point is not that I was right on that player. It's that people look at stuff like yards per route run, targets per route run, whatever the stat was, and they say it doesn't matter what stat you looked at because Christian Watson looked good in all the stats. And that's one of the things that I also want to point out is when people are like, this stat's slightly better than this stat or this or that, like it's the same underlying targets, receptions, yards that drive all of this essentially, right? I mean, we can do it on a per route basis, per game, a little bit different than the total volume. But essentially, like if Christian Watson has like that of a, like if what I just described was true, assume it's true, it may not be, but if he has a systemic element into his production, which is it's being boosted by like artificial means in garbage time or what have you, that's going to apply to, it doesn't matter what stat is slightly better. It's going to apply to all the stats, right? They're all going to show him as a very efficient and good player as a rookie that you want to bet on in year two. The unexplained variant side of it is the part where it's like, I don't believe that these stats are actually as predictive as the models will tell you in the aggregate they should be in this specific instance. So I use this term of misapplying the aggregate to the specific a lot. I don't remember where I first heard that, but I love it. And I think it happens a lot in fantasy analysis where it's like, it doesn't really matter what any of the context is. We know this to be the most predictive stat that we have. And this most predictive stat we have says that the numbers that we already all know, we could just go look at fantasy points. We could go look at Christian Watson's rookie year fantasy points. We don't need to look at his advanced stats. They say that he was good as a rookie. And so we're getting more and more advanced, but we're not actually advancing the predictiveness or the intelligence of the analysis. And I do understand that, yes, you can wade into questionable territory there. I've had great conversations with your guest yesterday, Josh Hermsmeyer, about this, where, you can get over your skis trying to predict the unexplained variance. You can use that as an excuse to say whatever you want, to say that this player's data isn't real because I think he's bad. That's not the correct application. I think you have to be very discerning in how you apply this, in my opinion. And it is difficult. Maybe it's more difficult than I'm letting on. But I do think in this era where the type of data that I was talking about is always baked into the market, you're going to want to have those types of contrarian positions when we talk about a market-based game where you're looking for value in this year's draft, right? You're going to want to be able to say, well, I mean, there's a huge advantage to saying, I don't want to take Christian Watson at the 4th or 5th round pick, even though I love to target that archetype of players in the aggregate, because I do. I'm still going to be overweight year two players and exciting ones and efficient ones, because I do believe the data says all of that, but I'm also willing to be discerning and choose Christian Watson as one that I don't want to have too much exposure to, because I do think there's some uniqueness to the way that his profile was, elevated to this plateau. So, that's the push and pull as we move forward and everything gets better and everyone understands this stuff more. I do think that type of, analytical aggressiveness, if you will, is warranted. You take a stand. I mean, it's one of those things like when I talk to like somebody like Hermsmeyer, he talks a lot about like strong opinions, loosely held or weakly held. Like that's, I think the way that I think about this type of a concept is like, sure. Like I'm saying I'm very confident that I'm right about something that I can't really prove about Christian Watson, but I want to take a stand on something and I want it to be based in actual data and the things that I want to be thinking about, but then also, where I believe that data is maybe not being particularly predictive in a specific situation. I think that's a very different situation or analytical approach than, 10 years ago when you and I were at RotoViz and the film versus analytics debate. The other side of it was like, well, this guy looks great on film, so you have to draft him. And it was all opinion based and there was no understanding of the data. I think a healthy respect for the models and the data and what it's all telling you, but also then a willingness to wade into the unexplained variance of what football data actually can't capture. That's the bridge for me.
Yeah, no, I think how I would think about it is rather like film analysis too often is like a confirmation of maybe whatever your initial feelings were about X player, maybe via film analysis, right? And the additional data. But if you have a model kind of foundation, and then you're working off of that with the film analysis, it at least helps you mitigate somewhat the like confirmation biasness of it, because you're not working off of a confirmation of your film opinion with new film. You're working off of a foundation which may differ from what you're looking at on film, and then working off of that. So I think that's interesting. All right, let's hit some of these again. I'm gonna play the dumb home league. I'm your brother-in-law, looking at these ADPs.
I have multiple brothers-in-law that I talk to about this stuff.
Okay, well, I'm hopefully they're not all doing best ball drafts this summer. They're normal people touching grass and enjoying enjoying themselves. So let's pretend I'm that person, and I'm looking at some of these ADPs that you degenerates are producing out of best ball. And maybe I don't have the best ADPs. I'm just looking on Fantasy Pros, what shows up here. So I got some questions that you can help explain to me whether you want to back your kindred best ball bros on this, or whether you think my very naive idea that pops into my head makes any sense. Okay, so let's look at the top of drafts here, and specifically for wide receivers, right? How about like Justin Jefferson, who it says here wide receiver 4. Now we're talking about 5th overall versus 2nd, 3rd, or 4th overall for CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, and Jamar Chase. So not a big deal, not a big difference, with Amon-Ra St. Brown at 8th and A.J. Brown at 9th. I don't know. Like, what about Justin Jefferson as the best non-quarterback in the NFL? So we just draft him higher.
I think
does that sound good or not?
That's a fair take. So
I mean, Sam Darnold, like, I get it, but he's not like, it's not like you're necessarily having the worst quarterback play who's going to be coming in there, right? I don't know.
No, I mean, I think it's a great point. And so again, when I was talking about the Christian Watson thing, I think one of the things that I should have also said is you have to understand I think when you're thinking about the actual R squared and the analysis and stuff, you have to understand what the correlation actually is, and why the R squared is high, and what it's telling you, to be able to respect it, but also come to different conclusions. In these type of situations, I think you need to understand why the market is telling you what it is, right? Because that's my immediate response this year when I jump into ADP is like, why is Justin Jefferson not the wide receiver 1 again? Like, yeah, he got hurt last year, but are we assuming he's going to get hurt this year because he's still Justin Jefferson?
I mean, I assume it's a quarterback thing, right?
The reason is the quarterback.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So a lot of research into, again, aggregate research into rookie quarterbacks not being able to support elite high-end wide receiver seasons. I think you can go against that. I think it's hard to go against it versus 2 particular receivers, which are the top 2, CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill. CeeDee Lamb had such a massive rate of routes and then volume per route. And the Dallas offense is so fast and pass heavy, and also did nothing at running back this offseason, where he's going to run a massive number of routes again. And so one of the big concerns with Jefferson is he's just going to run fewer routes. They're not going to call as many passes. Now, Kevin O'Connell, sharp coach, and actually will have a higher pass rate than you would expect. He did with Nick Mullins and Josh Dobbs. And I think there's enough evidence there that he's not going to completely abandon the pass just because he has a rookie quarterback. You do still need to throw to win in the NFL. And so I do think Jefferson's going to have enough volume to still be worth a first-round pick. I think if you really look at the aggregate data, it's going to tell you that you can't even draft Jefferson at 6. That's just still too high. But the question of like whether he can really reach a ceiling season for Justin Jefferson is an important one. So Lamb is the one side of it. Tyreek's the other side of it, which is a guy whose targets per route, and I look at a weighted targets per route that brings in air yards, are so much higher than every other receiver in the league. He doesn't actually run the same number of raw routes, but the way that McDaniel can scheme up the ball to the guys that he wants to get the ball to, because when Jalen Waddle's like 12th in the league in a stat that Tyreek Hill's running away from, he's higher than a lot of the other wide receiver 1s in the NFL. Miami is just so good at getting the ball on a per route basis to Tyreek Hill, and then he adds massive efficiency. We're talking about efficiency outliers. That's one of the concerns with Jefferson. He's going to have a lower catchable target rate. It's harder to see him have like a 9+ yards per target, 10+ yards per target, massive TD rate in an offense that's expected to not score a ton of points. When I went through my projection process, like, I do think he's amazing. And this is a great example of where I think you can do what you just said. The aggregate data is telling me that Justin Jefferson can't be good enough because the market's saying that the Vikings aren't going to score enough points. He's going to score fewer touchdowns than any other top 5 wide receivers because they're not going to score enough points. His yards per target's going to be lower than the other guys. because his quarterback play is going to be bad and not get him the ball. But I think he elevates all of that. He's just better than everyone else. And so I'm going to take him, above Jamar Chase and above, maybe even Lamb and Tyreek Hill, because I'm that in on Justin Jefferson as a talent. And I think you can do that. I honestly am okay with that, because I do think one of the big things we see over multiple years, and why some of this stuff about like being willing to go away from the aggregate research matters, is one of the things that we consistently see across everything is the outliers are elite talents. The guys that break these types of aggregate things are the best players in their generations, right? So I don't really care about rookie QB data with a whole bunch of receivers that aren't Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson is the differentiating element to why this is a different situation than that. Having said that, there's the short answer for me is there's a lot of other really good wide receivers. He's in that tier, but I do tend to slot him behind Lamb, Hill, and even, Jamar Chase, because it's hard to see a scenario where he's the true number one, just from a pure routes basis, and that he can get the efficiency necessary. I think he's going to be more efficient than he should be with his quarterback play, but that it's hard to see this like elite, efficiency that Lamb should have with Dak and Hill should have with Tua.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, maybe Jamar Chase is the guy that I've cooled on a bit since his, that outliers type of efficiency that he had his rookie season going forward. All right, so I want to talk a team-based one where, again, this is like a person who doesn't know anything. You say, okay, we got Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, and Tank Dell. Wide receiver 13, 23, and 28, according to this data that I'm looking at now. I don't know. Like, why is one guy any better than the other guy? I don't know. I guess am I attaching too much name brandedness to Stephon Diggs for what they may do this season?
I think some people are really out on Diggs. This is one of the trickiest ones. And the way my answer is sort of by all of them. The way that I think about this, they're all going very high. And you in the past have done great research looking at when, you have all these guys going really high. What does that mean for the quarterback? And essentially the market is telling us that we should be in on the Houston passing game. That this is a team that's going to throw a lot. I think in year 2, when Stroud was such a big hit last year, that I had this theory that like over multiple years, teams are, early on kind of finding their legs and really trying to test the bounds of what they can do statistically. And then later on, like the Chiefs last year talked about how they limited Travis Kelce's routes intentionally. They're not really trying to win massively in the regular season. They're holding stuff back for the postseason because they expect to be there in the postseason. They want to win Super Bowls. And so it's a little bit different. Like, can Patrick Mahomes have another 5,000 yard, 50 touchdown season? I tend to lean no, because they're not actually like, they're willing to run with Pacheco when it's inefficient, because they're just like, this is week 8. We don't care. We care about week 20, right? The Texans in that lifespan, if you buy that, they hit last year, and now they're in a rookie QB window, and they went and traded a 2nd-round pick for Stephon Diggs and even restructured him to a 1-year deal, and he's probably not going to be with them next year. This is the year where they see how elite CJ Stroud, the 5,050 year that Patrick Mahomes had in his second season, the MVP season that Lamar Jackson had in his first breakout season. This feels like that year for CJ Stroud and why he's going so high. And when you add Stephon Diggs, I think that is a huge positive for NFL, for pass rate. I think people would mention, well, they added Joe Mixon as well. But in terms of the level of talent and what these guys bring, you would feel a lot better about Diggs influencing the trends and those types of things. The big thing about like why you can still be on Diggs and attaching name value to him is that the volume was still there last year. It wasn't as good last year. The efficiency side of it wasn't as good. I look at the wide receiver data in 3 parts. We used to always in fantasy look at it as opportunity and efficiency. I look at it in 3 parts, where the routes are the opportunity, the target earning is like the first efficiency layer, but we've always talked about targets as opportunity. So it's kind of a hybrid. And then the after the target is yards per target, TD rate, catch rate. That's the really unsticky stuff that can fluctuate. Diggs' 4 seasons in Buffalo, the target earning was elite every year. And it goes back to Minnesota. He's only ever been a guy who earns really, really high volume, per route, layer in the air yards and do weighted targets per route, very consistent volume. He's a true like number 1 in that regard, or has been to this point. But his yards per target, some of that type of efficiency has bounced around. And that's why he's had some good years with Buffalo and some bad years. It was really good the first year. It was bad the second year. It was good the third year. It was bad the fourth year last year. And so he's already rebounded from one of these types of seasons. I think going to a new team and on a 1-year deal, some of the Diggs stuff can be, attitude based, and some of that people worry about that element of it. I think he's going to be kind of on his best behavior, right? Like he's going to be a free agent after the year. I think he brings a lot to Houston, and I think there's scenarios where he's sort of the clear alpha. But having said that, Nico was elite last year and gets the incumbent advantage. We often see wide receivers who change teams need a little bit of time to adjust to a new offense, to a new quarterback. Nico and Tank have the incumbent advantage, both of them. And Nico was a 3+ yards per hour run guy last year, but he doesn't have as long of a target earning alpha profile as Diggs. You go back just the year prior, he had bad quarterback play, but also wasn't on the Diggs level in terms of volume earning as a sophomore, and certainly not as a rookie. For what Diggs was when Diggs first came out, or what Diggs has been over the course of his career. So there's a lot of nuance to it. The way I look at these types of situations, though, with all three of them going really high, is we want to bet on the situation, and there's a lot of contingent value as well. If any of these three were to miss time, I would take the other two above their ADP right now. So they're this type of player that I consider this small miss, big hit player. That is the type of player that I think you should be trying to get in all of your picks in fantasy. And so this idea that, like, oh yeah, they don't project particularly well because all three of them are in the same offense and there's only so much volume to go around, I'm fading that, and I'm buying the broader wisdom of the crowd's element that is buying into this passing game. I want good players in a good passing game. It's not really Nico versus Diggs versus Tank for me. It's like at different layers and different prices. I want access to all of them.
Okay. Talk me into Jamir. Are you willing to talk me into Jamir Gibbs? Like, what's explain that one to me necessarily, because presumably they theoretically wanted to get him the ball last year, right? Like, you hear these coaches, it's like the coaches are like, oh my God, you won't believe what this running back's going to do in the slot this year. Or, oh, you won't believe this 2 running back system that we're going to run this year. It just never happens, right? It just never happens. And presumably they wanted to get Jamir Gibbs the ball, and it just didn't happen. So, like, yeah, I assume they want to give him the ball even more this year. But I guess the second year jump sort of thing, maybe I see it a little bit more at receiver, who just wasn't ready to gather targets, who's then ready to jump forward, than at running back. But I mean, I can be talked into it. I don't even know, like you mentioned, running backs are getting pushed down the boards so much that maybe RB4, as it says here, isn't that big of a deal if you have like questionable guys like Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, etc. below him. But give me the case. What do you think about Gibbs? Because I guess that's one that jumped out at me, and I was a little bit surprised to see in the top 4.
Well, that note about the RB4 thing, I think, is huge, because I think there's 3 clear elite profiles. You have Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, and Breece Hall, and that's like, those are you want to be in on. I think if you have multiple leagues, you want to probably have some access to those early running backs, because those are the guys that I think could sort of define the season. Gibbs is the sort of the best of the rest in my mind. So in terms of, trying to sell him, I'm not necessarily like jumping out of my seat to go draft him. I wouldn't take him ahead of the last of the first tier of elite receivers, which includes like Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, and AJ Brown. And then I think Gibbs can come into the equation. I think he's better in PPR. You talked about the receiving developing. He didn't have as good of a receiving role last year as I think a lot expected, and it may have actually developed for him in year 2. This is a guy who had really dynamic receiving peripherals in college and in his profile. He was like a 3 yards per route run player as a running back for a couple of his college seasons. Very, very strong in that area. And then when Montgomery missed some time, showed that he could be a workhorse runner as well, and was very efficient in his rushing, was efficient. Well, he was actually fairly inefficient with his receiving, but he was better in the playoffs. And if you bring that into the sample, like, I'm willing to bet against the fact that he had like 4.5 yards per target. The average for a running back's like 6. I'm not only do I think he's not going to be below average in yards per target, I think he's going to be in most cases above average in yards per target because of how dynamic he was in college as a receiver. So I think there's a lot of ways you can talk yourself into him having a really strong efficiency season, and the ways that we were talking about looking for outliers. Now, I do think, you're sort of alluding to, like, David Montgomery's there, and like, is this guy really going to have the type of workload that you need from a superstar running back? I think those elements of the equation are trickier with him. Like, Montgomery's going to be a part of the offense. I think, I was just talking about if the contingent value, if one of the Houston receivers goes down, and I think the contingent value here is massive. If David Montgomery were to suffer a real injury, that Jamir Gibbs would belong with the top 3 guys, probably, the way that he profiles, because the receiving is such a huge part of fantasy scoring. It's kind of like the Konami Code for quarterbacks that we talked about earlier. Like, when a receiver can catch 50, 60, 70, 80 balls, they finish in the top of running back scoring. Like, that's huge. There's more yardage on those plays, even in half PPR. I mean, you're not getting as much points on the receptions, but you're getting it's an easier path to 1,400, 1,500 yards when you catch a bunch of balls. So he's a guy that I can talk myself into, but I think is a little bit less of a ceiling play, a pure ceiling play than like Bijan or Brees. And so he's a tricky one where, yeah, I'll rank him RB4, but that's more about there not being a clear, if there was another Bijan or Brees type profile, I would put them ahead of Gibbs probably.
Yeah, I mean, it does look like he had a really big game with 26 rushing attempts, one of the games that Montgomery was out. But then, never really more than, I don't know, maybe 15, and actually not that many attempts during the playoffs, but whatever's playoff games. So we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. I think the receiving thing is probably something that didn't come through quite as much as you would have hoped for. That would have been his saving thing. Okay, so let me think. One more I'll talk about here. I was going to talk about Drake May, but then maybe not. I was thinking, like, does he have any like Herbert type of potential? But maybe not. And even then, it's like it's not that big of a deal for winning leagues or something like that. So Marvin Harrison Jr. Now we're talking about old themes. There was something that stuck out to me a lot, and I think it's changed. I think it's changed over time. But one of my favorite articles back in the day by Coleman Kelly, if you remember him, he was writing some stuff at RotoViz. He had a piece that was called, I don't know which player was listed first. I think it was like DeAndre Hopkins, Alshon Jeffrey, and rookie derangement syndrome is what he called it, which was pushing up these rookies versus like second-year players or third-year players who could potentially break out because we're so enamored with rookies versus some of these guys. So I'm getting some of these vibes. Obviously, we've had some big rookie seasons, like we mentioned Jamar Chase the other day, also on some big outlier type efficiency. So when we look at like a Marvin Harrison versus, let me see, who else is going below him in that sort of range right now?
Chris Olave or
Drake London, maybe that's going in there. Where these guys, like, if they get the right quarterback play and things are ready to go, we're talking about hit the ground running type of situation for them, versus what we're seeing from Marvin Harrison, which is a lot more question marks. I just feel like sometimes these rookies, they have no discount or very little discount for like, will they be as good as we think they will be? And I realize he's like the generational, the every other year generational prospect of this draft. But I wonder about it a little bit.
Yeah. So this is one that, I've actually been a little bit out on Harrison, even though I love this archetype of player and typically am in on this type of a player. And part of it is the rookie element of it. I think it's fascinating, to the way that you framed it, I think is there in the data. Like, so Puka Nacua, I think, is driving this a little bit. Last year he had 160 targets, and we saw like just an elite ceiling from a rookie right out of the gate. But that was a really unique situation and system. They had no depth behind Cooper Kupp. The presumed wide receiver 2 was Van Jefferson. They wound up trading him in season. He had never really panned out for them. Kupp gets hurt, gets re-injured. And Nakua's there and gets 20 targets week 1 and 15 in week 2. Like, it's just like, okay, this is working, and we're going to keep going to it. You mentioned Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, also the other recent huge rookie hit. Both of those guys averaged at least 2.0 targets per game more in year 2 than in year 1. And I think that goes back to,
it looks like Jefferson was wide receiver 6 as a rookie. So again, we're talking about like potentially the best player in the NFL, and he was wide receiver 6. So then you start to wonder about what your upside is. But go ahead.
That's exactly right. And that's the concern for me too. I think one of the things that people who are drafting Harrison keep emphasizing is how rookies over a larger sample tend to have a lot of back-weighted production. And we know that to be true. But a big part of that is a lot of the rookies don't play right away. A.J. Brown, for whatever reason, even though he was immediately productive, I think week 2 had a 100-yard game, stayed at about 40% of the snaps the first month, then about 60% of the snaps the next month, and then about week 9, week 10, he actually jumped to a full workload. And from then on, he was the wide receiver 2. And so Amon-Ra St. Brown, similar, was absolute smash late in the season. These are examples of why we show in the aggregate data some back-weighted production. Now, it's still true of a guy like a Chase who played immediate that he had some back-weighted production. And the way I think of that is like, it takes a little time for the rookie to earn the trust of the play caller and be the first read on the targets, late in the year. But late in the year, they can start to really rack up the target volume more. And I think that's possible with Harrison. You're telling yourself that story that he's really on that level late, but you got to get a hit. You have to be a hit still. And I think Harrison's an incredible prospect and is likely to be one. but both Chase and Jefferson as rookie hits were in the 120 to 130 range in targets. To justify this price, I want a guy who can get 150, 160 targets like Puka Nacua did last year. And I think it's possible for Harrison, but I'll also throw out that Harrison has a mobile quarterback, which impacts team pass volume a little bit. He has a tight end in his offense who had a massive breakout last year. I think is going even a little bit overlooked in Trey McBride, 2+ yards per route run. I think, he's going to be a really dynamic weapon as well. It's hard for me to envision that Harrison's going to immediately jump into like a 30% target share, which you can tell yourself Drake London and Chris Olave can have that type of a year. They can be that guy. Devontae Adams is going behind him. He's been a 30% target share guy 4 years in a row. I understand he's old and I understand his quarterback plays bad, but like targets still matter. This is one of those things we were talking about where, some of the data is going a certain direction. It's like, sometimes I just find myself being like, when Fantasy Douche years ago wrote that piece, like targets are the lifeblood of fantasy scoring. And, 20 years ago, you and I would just, when we were playing and first reading stuff, we would be reading analysis about how targets, how to project targets matter. And that was the extent of the analysis. And I feel like we've sort of gone so far the other direction that people don't realize that like, you still need targets that like they raise the floor and the ceiling, right? You need efficiency. I was just talking about the outlier efficiency stuff. My buddy Pat Crane did a really good piece last year on how rookies hit and how their route volume tends to be a little lower. And when they do hit, they hit on efficiency. And I think you're betting on talent when you bet on these guys. And
that's Jamar Chase, right? I mean, Chase had 128 targets. I mean, that's it as a rookie.
Yeah.
But I think he had the highest or second highest yards per target as in the NFL that season.
And I'm comfortable betting on that type of efficiency at the right cost, betting on these guys that are really dynamic profiles and potentially being awesome. I'm taking a lot of Malik Neighbors once you get into the third round, which is kind of, not consistent with not being in love with Harrison in the early second, because that's kind of a flat tier and it's not that big of a gap in terms of pricing.
I think it's a big difference. I think it's a big difference in cost. I think it's a huge difference in cost for players who are rank ordered not that differently in the NFL draft. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there's some elements of it where you're like, okay, but I also think, Neighbors has probably a better path to doing the Puka Nacua stuff. When you get, again, I like to parse the little details. He doesn't have Trey McBride in his offense, right? He doesn't have anyone in his offense. Like the Giants are like grasping at something. That's why they drafted him so high. I think the Cardinals are too, but Michael Wilson was actually a little bit of an efficient player last year. They have Greg Dortch, they have Zay Jones they brought in. I don't think those guys are going to really, really matter, but I do think the secondary pieces in Arizona are more impactful, particularly Trey McBride, are more impactful for how high Harrison's ceiling can get in terms of pure volume. And then you're already making the assumption that he's an immediate hit, that he's running full routes week one, which I do think we're going to see, that he's immediately as efficient as the best receivers in the league, right? Like maybe Drake London and Chris Olave aren't considered the best receivers, but like, again, Devonta Adams goes after him. Deebo Samuel goes after him. Brandon Ayuk goes after him. There's a lot of really good players that we're saying Marvin Harrison is going to be immediately more efficient than. I don't have an issue with that. I did write a piece last year called Get Ready or Get Comfortable Assuming Rookies Will Be Stars. Like that's part of my whole kind of thought process. But this is more than just assuming it. This is baking it fully into the price. And then even if he is a hit, as you said, Jefferson was wide receiver 6. He's not even that much of a hit. He's not this like high ceiling wide receiver 1 overall type play. That I think if Olave or London really had a breakout year with a little bit of different scenarios, different offenses for both of them this year, they've earned volume per route in a big way. Those guys could be guys I could see drafted up there in the very top of the drafts next year where they had that type of, massive breakout. Jalen Waddle is another guy that goes after him where the volume's not there, but talked about how concentrated Miami's pass game can be. I think the contingent upside for him as a guy with a high ADP, but you also think about there's some contingent meat on that bone. If Tyreek Hill misses time, like Jalen Waddle is going to be a top 5 wide receiver for that stretch. I pretty much have no doubt because of the way that they can get the ball to their best players, or at least that's the way that I would project it. I shouldn't say I have no doubt, but I would certainly have no doubt that I would project him as a top 5 player for that stretch. And so, thinking through those things is really tricky. Harrison's a tough one for me. I don't want to be completely out, but I don't take a lot of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, do you mind taking a couple questions here that we have, and we'll get through here. Okay, from Jonas. Will fantasy community finally quit on Kyle Pitts after 2024 if he doesn't produce? I would say I'm looking at ADP here, and 62nd overall at tight end 6, a little bit ahead of Evan Ingram. I mean, that is quitting, right? That's basically quitting. Yep. It's at least quiet quitting or whatever you call it. Like,
right.
It's most of the way to quitting. Okay. It's you're taking 2 martini lunches and you're hoping you're going to get fired at this point, right? I mean, that basically is quitting.
It really is. And again, that's my answer is it goes back to this being a market-based game. And this is a guy who I wrote in my targets per out run pieces this offseason that if we took away his name, I wrote, you strip the name Kyle Pitts and all the attached scarring for fantasy managers. And basically this is a profile that it'd be extremely obvious to bet on him. Now at this time he was going like tight end 10, but his ADOT is 12.3 for his career. His career targets per out runs up around 22%. When you do like a weighted targets per out run, like I like to do, there's 22 players in the NFL last year. 0 of them are tight ends that ran at least 100 routes and had a higher weighted targets per out run than Pitts' career, which is 1,100 routes. Like this is who this guy is. There's actually some talk that in this new offense, his ADOT could come down. But the reason you would actually be in on him is this is a completely new offense. His catchable target rate last year was terrible. You're getting Kirk Cousins, who's actually known for catchable target rate. That's something that he can do well for you for a fantasy receiver. You're also getting Arthur Smith, the lowest pass rate over expected last year, the biggest negative pass rate over expected, and second lowest the year prior. They don't throw in Atlanta, right? Well, now you're getting a Rams offense, Zach Robinson. You're getting Kirk Cousins. You're going to see the pass rate over expected, probably at least close to neutral. It's not going to be negative 10%, right? And so if it's close to neutral, you're adding a ton of pass volume. There's basically only room to go up there. I mean, everything about Pitts' 2024 looks great, but there's all this, scarring for fantasy managers. And so he's actually a massive value. If you look at it from any projection-based perspective or anything like that, look at his profile. Again, the ways that guys can hit, what do I get if I'm right? His profile is a type of tight end profile that can score like a wide receiver. And you're like, that's the cheat code. That's the Konami code for tight ends, is this high ADOT explosive player. Because a lot of the tight ends, even Trey McBride, who I love, is a low ADOT guy. He's got to really compile receptions. Kyle Pitts can make big plays in a way that would be, he could have a yards per reception. He can run it up over 15. His rookie year, his yards per reception was up around 20, had 1,000-yard season at age 21. That's the other thing. He's super young. I'm not going to quit on a dude who's like 23 right now. Like, what are we talking about?
Okay. Ben's all in on Kyle Pitts. And I do think Kirk Cousins is one of these guys where, he's really good. I mean, we'll say that obviously there's injuries concerns here, right? But he's really good at like getting the ball from point A to point B and into his receiver's hands. I mean, he's always been an above average CPOE type of guy. The problem is like, he's not very good at third downs. He'll check the ball down rather than taking a risk. Sometimes fourth downs, forget about it. He's horrible on those. He does those sorts of things, but like none of that matters for our purposes. That matters for the Atlanta Falcons winning ball games more than it matters for what we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's almost a feature, not a bug, because some of that stuff means that they're going to trail and have to throw more in the fourth quarter. That's probably why his teams always throw 600 times.
I mean, also, I think his accuracy is helpful when you're like target feeding players like a Justin Jefferson too, if he knows he can get the ball to him. So that's interesting. Okay, another question from Giannis here. What's the most predictive stat for wide receiver fantasy production? I don't know. Previous year wide receiver fantasy production is probably the most predictive stat. But again, we don't want to get too much into stat looking at here, because I think we've run through that quite a bit. Let me skip.
We've talked. Yeah, well, we talked about that specific question of like, maybe don't think about it in terms of what is the most predictive stat. Like, why are we comparing the stats to each other? Like, that's probably not the right way to think through it. They're all not perfect. They're all imperfect, right? I like to use targets per out run because I know what's like, you can build these complex models. You don't know what's going into the model. I know what targets per out run is telling me. And then I can layer in the context. I can layer in, there's a lot of context that needs to be layered in with targets per out run. The ADOT, the number of routes, whether I think that player can then expand his routes, and whether that targets per out run can stick on an expanded role, who the other 4 eligible receivers are in a route. So I often talk about a guy can earn a lot of targets per route when he's running against bums, basically. Like, there's 5 eligibles on a play. Now, if you're in the 49ers offense, it's a lot tougher because 4 of the 5 eligibles are Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, and George Kittle. It's going to hold down their targets per route. So I don't compare it as apples to apples across, different teams or whatever, but it's a pretty predictive stat of itself. It's not super predictive of fantasy production. I can layer in all the other stuff, the after the target efficiency and all that. And it's a skill-based stat that I really like to use as a foundational element that I can add the context into after.
Okay, let's go down here. It says fantasy football becomes sharper. I think we kind of answered that one a little bit. Okay, why are yards more valuable for quarterbacks? Not sure if we need to answer that one. Anything else on here? Oh, here we go. It says if a team doubles Justin Jefferson, who are they worried about? I mean, has that kind of always been the case? I mean, I don't know.
Right.
Like, is that any different than at any other point in his career? I guess if Jordan Addison can stay out of prison, they'll have to worry about him or wherever he's going. No legal advice here. I don't really know. I don't know where he's going exactly.
I
As
do think there.
fantasy, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I do think there's some risk of that, but I would point again to Devontae Adams. A guy is that good, earned 175 targets last year when he had like Jacoby Myers and basically no one else. You know, people thought Hunter Renfrow was going to be the third receiver in that passing game last year. Michael Mayer didn't really come on. They end up drafting Brock Bowers this year. The point is, teams were doubling Devontae Adams with the Raiders last year, and he put up a 30% target share. Justin Jefferson is good enough that he's going to still put up a 30% target share. In fact, it's almost a feature, again, not a bug, where it's like if Jordan Addison's out, if TJ Hawkinson's rehabbing, like who are they going to throw to? They're going to just force it to Justin Jefferson.
Yeah. I never got the argument where people it was a little bit of 3D chess sort of argument of, well, bringing in this target, this other good receiver is going to free up the first receiver. And I was like, I'd rather have no one who's any good. It's just the dominant receiver and have that guy get a bunch of targets. And then you're just hoping that they get the good efficiency on top of that. So,
right. I think if there is a target and efficiency push and pull a little. I think if there's another guy
it exists for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to be higher on a player because he just got some target.
It's just more volume versus less efficiency is sort of the way I think about it. If Justin Jefferson's good, he's going to get the ball.
Let me see what else. Maybe one other one, and then we can get out of here. So I guess we talked about whether it's become sharper or not, fantasy football. And okay, well, this is interesting though, because he mentions let me bring this up real fast. Where'd it go? Here we go. So it's become sharper from Marco here. I feel like Nakua, who came out from nowhere, I saw tweets about before the season. I mean, is that just like the proliferation of the draft evaluation industrial complex that like literally everyone's on everyone before the season starts? I think one way that I've noticed over the years that I think like DFS has become sharper is just like, for instance, for someone like Nakua, once they start producing, they're willing to just go for it and go all in on him earlier. And I think that's a smart thing to do also. It's like, we don't really know. You don't want to overemphasize like a 1 year sometimes of a production over the next year. But during a season, I think it can make a big difference. You should be reacting a lot to what happens early.
Yeah, I agree. And my biggest thought here would be that Nakua is, again, like a decade-long outlier and not somebody that we should draw too much attention or like too many conclusions from. But one of the reasons we were hearing tweets about him is he was just blowing up camp for a young guy. And we knew there was not like a clear wide receiver 2 there. I mean, the team that I've said that feels like the Rams last year is the Cowboys this year, where they have the elite number 1 CeeDee Lamb and no one else who can really earn volume. Brandon Cooks really fell off in that target spread run stat last year. Doesn't look like a strong volume earner anymore. Was really buoyed by touchdown production. Jake Ferguson is a fine tight end, but he's not like a real additive target earner. He's just kind of going to run a lot of routes. And so Jalen Tolbert started to get some buzz in camp. I'm not saying he's this year's Puka Nacua at all, but there's guys that I'm looking at the situation. I'm going like, if Lamb suffered an injury like Kupp did last year, the floor is open for somebody in the Cowboys passing game to suddenly get a ton of volume. So, if you want to do the Puka thing, I think you need to think about the situation itself. The reason that part of why I think the tweets were about him was everyone was trying to figure out who was even going to catch passes behind Cooper Kupp in that Rams passing game last year.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. That was one actually I initially had put on, was like comparing him to Cooper Kupp this year. But I guess Cooper Kupp is 30, so maybe it makes sense that there's a differentiation between those two. All right, Ben. So Substack, Stealing Signals. You got the podcast now along with that. What else do we want to plug that you're working on, and give us a little preview of what's going to be coming in the next few weeks here before the season gets started?
Yeah, I'm going to be writing a ton before the season starts. A lot. I do team by team breakdowns. I'll be doing, my rankings are coming out this week. Tiers based analysis, all sorts of strategy and sort of one off pieces. Some more macro level discussions for the fantasy space. I'd love to hit on those topics. I'm certain, I made that clear on this show. So that's at bengretch.substack.com. That's the source for all of my written content. Also have the Stealing Bananas podcast with Sean Siegel over on the RotoViz Airwaves, the Ship Chasing podcast with Pat Crane and Pete Overzet over on their YouTube channel, my own YouTube channel for Stealing Signals as well. Those are the three other places that you can find me yap about the fantasy landscape.
Okay, well, this was awesome. I'm glad that you joined me. 7 a.m. West Coast time. You're still on the West Coast, right? So I appreciate that, soldiering on. Someone was mentioning thought you had a late night draft last night. Is that true?
I did. So Siegel messaged me and said, "Hey, should we jump on and do a late night FFPC draft that started 8:30 my time?" And I'm like, I'm usually in bed by 9, but all right. He's more of a night owl. I'm more of an early riser. Yeah. So I was like, all right,
I'll jump on. He's in KC. Is he in KC still or no?
No, he's in Arizona. He
grew
Arizona.
Up okay, so you guys are West Coast guys. Okay, both of you guys.
Yeah.
All right.
So we jumped in a late night draft last night and streamed it until, I don't know, at least 10. And then I was up till midnight because I'm getting off a stream that late and chatting with him a little after the stream. I usually go to bed again, like 9 o'clock. So yeah, it's a little slower morning for me.
Yeah. Well, you can, the early bed, man, I miss, because I grew up in California. I miss having everything done. I get a little bit of a taste now that I've become like an international soccer fan. I get a little bit of a taste of like everything being done very early in the day and the enjoyment out of that. But man, I can't stay up for these late night games. All right. Anyway,
we're getting old.
Thanks so much. Thanks for everyone for tuning in. The questions on here. I'll be back at you next week with Hermsmeyer on Tuesday. And until then, I'll be talking at you later. Thanks, guys.